What is up, Stallions fans? Your Birmingham Stallions are now 6-0, still undefeated on the season, the only UFL team to be so, and they got that 6 win against the Memphis Showboats. Always great to be a local rival and to stay undefeated against the Bandits slash Showboats since the USFL came back in 2022, moving to 6-0 against those franchises. So we're going to talk about how it went down on this episode, give a recap of the game, talk about some star players and everything you need to know. This is State of the Stallions. Thanks for tuning in.
Here we go. Hey, giddy up on three. 1, 2, 3. Giddy up.
You can feel the buzz when you're around this city. People have fallen in love with the Birmingham Stallions. Here we go. We're getting a little juice going.
And Birmingham is going to win the USFL championship.
So despite a slow start, the Stallions were able to run away with this one against the Showboats with a final score of 39-21. Actually, the most points the defense has given up this year, the first time they've given up more than 20 points. So that part wasn't ideal, but the offense scored the most points they have this year with 39. So the defense didn't need to give up much less than they did. Overall, I thought it was a great performance from the team. Again, we're going to talk about a couple key sort of takeaways from the game, but the offense after the first kind of possession or two, sort of the first quarter, really got humming and looked pretty much unstoppable with Adrian Martinez at the helm again. The defense was very opportunistic, forced 3 turnovers, which was huge in the game and really sort of kept Memphis from staying in it. So it was a great performance all around by the team. As far as my takeaways, the first one has to be Adrian Martinez can do it all. And I hesitate to continue talking about him over and over on this show because I know quarterbacks get a lot of love, they get a lot of attention, and I try and sort of distribute the wealth, so to speak. But I've gotta take the time, I think, to shout him out because his performance was so impressive. I think the thing about Martinez, which I've said and lots have said, is we all knew what he could do with his legs. The question was, if it came down to him winning a game with his arm, is that something he was capable of? And he demonstrated against this Showboats team, which again isn't the greatest team in the league. I get that, but still, professional football team, great football players, and he was able to carve up their secondary like it was nothing. He had almost 400 passing yards and 4 touchdowns, no interceptions. His passer rating was 135, which is darn near perfect. Again, it's just hard to, you can't say enough good things about his performance in his game. And you could tell the Showboats coming into it, their sort of game plan was to eliminate his running ability, whatever the cost. They did not want him to beat them with his legs, which I totally get because he's been doing that every game that he's been in. He's ran all over teams. So what the Showboats did, I'm not an expert at football, but I did used to play, believe it or not, and did used to coach actually. So I at least understand a tiny bit about the game, just enough to be dangerous. And defensively, what Carnell Lake, the Showboats defensive coordinator, decided to do was spy Martinez, which is just to kind of break it down in layman's terms for those who might not be familiar with this. It just means that they had a defensive player who basically his only job was to sort of line up across from the quarterback and sort of mirror him. And whenever he went, follow him. So that way, if he does take off and run, he's accounted for and you have somebody who can tackle him. A lot of times teams will spy with a linebacker, or historically that's sort of how it worked. But the problem is with Martinez, because he's so athletic and he's so fast, there's no linebacker in this league, probably in any league, that could kind of keep up with him one-on-one. So that's not really going to cut it. So what they did, and if you heard about it, they kind of actually talked about this on the broadcast, but what they did is they rolled to one high safety, meaning they took their 2 safeties. They had one of them drop back into coverage, and they had the second one, which was actually TJ Green, who's a former Stallion. He's actually from Sylacauga, graduated from Sylacauga, went and played at Clemson, was an early round NFL draft pick, joined the Stallions last year, but was cut mid-season and then picked up by the Showboats, who he still plays with. They were rolling him down and having him guard or be a spy for Martinez. And because he's an athletic safety, he's actually able to kind of keep up with Martinez. So Martinez actually really couldn't do much with his legs because anytime he got out of the pocket or started to take off down the field, Green was there to sort of force him out of bounds or wrap him up before he got too far. So he only had like 25 rushing yards, only I think 5 carries, which was hardly anything compared to what he's been doing. But it didn't matter because Martinez said, fine, you want me to beat you with my arm? You want to play man coverage against our fantastic receivers? Sure, go ahead. And I'll just throw some beautiful deep balls, some perfect passes, rack up almost 400 yards, and put up almost 40 points. So I think, again, just seeing the development, the progression of Martinez, again, we know what he can do with his legs. He's obviously a playmaker, but seeing what he could do with his arm, in a game where, again, he was sort of forced to only use his arm. It's one thing when you're sort of doing both, like you're running the ball and that's opening things up in the pass game and vice versa. It's another thing where all you can basically do is pass. You're just being forced to pass, and you know that that's kind of what's coming. The secondary knows that's what's coming, and you're still successful. So, again, just a super impressive performance by him. He's the complete package. He's the real deal. I don't think there's any question about that. RJ Young put out his MVP power rankings heading into week 6, and he actually had Adrian Martinez at number 1, despite the fact that he's only started a couple games. And he kind of got mocked and real ridiculed online for that. And to an extent, I get that because Adrian just hasn't played that much relative to some other guys. But I mean, I think Martinez kind of vindicated RJ Young with his performance. I mean, again, assuming he continues to play throughout the rest of the season, even without starting those first couple games at the beginning of the year, the way he's playing, the numbers he could end up putting up, how dominant the Stallions have been, I don't think there's any question that he could win the MVP if things continue on the trend they're on. So, got to shout out Adrian. Incredible game by him. My second takeaway was just the depth of this team. Speaking of Adrian, speaking of the passing game, the way he was distributing the ball to so many different guys, again, it was just so impressive. I think, if you count it up, I want to say there was like 10 or 11 guys that caught a pass in the game, and that was running backs, tight ends, wide receivers. Just to use the tight ends, for example, again, we all know who Jay Sternberg is. We all know what he can do. Set the USFL record last year for touchdown catches. Incredible player. But this week, we also saw the emergence of Jordan Thomas, who had 3 2-point conversion catches. He had an incredible one-headed catch down the sideline. The dude is a monster. I mean, he is massive. He's got incredible hands. He can move really well. And then Marcus Ball also had a couple catches, who's in a lot of ways been used primarily as a blocking tight end, but he got in the game too. So if you look at our tight end room, this game, the 3 of them combined had about, let me put it this way. If you look at their stats individually, none of them are necessarily that impressive, right? It's like 2 catches for 40 yards, 2 catches for 40 yards, 1 catch for 30 yards. Like individually, none of them are going to blow you away. If you combine them all together, collectively, the unit had 5 catches for over 100 yards, which again, from your tight end sort of room, that's great. But again, it's just sort of the way the ball is being distributed. It's not just one guy that we're banking on. And the same thing is true with the wide receiver room. And when we saw Kevin Austin go off this week, who's not really done much up to this point, right? Marlon Williams had kind of his biggest game of the year. Obviously Deion Kane was involved. Ricky Person and CJ Marable, both in the rushing and receiving game, were involved. I mean, Benjamin Victor had a couple catches. So Amari Rogers had a catch before he got hurt. So that just goes to show you, again, sort of the depth that this team has. And I think that's a big difference between this team and, for example, last year's team post-merger is maybe the starting talent is similar, but when you get to that sort of second level, like the sort of quote-unquote backup guys that come in, there's really not a drop-off at all. And again, that's sort of the product of the merger where you have all these starters on other teams who have now sort of been distributed amongst the Stallions and other teams that are still in the league. And so the depth is just really impressive. And I think, that's something that's exciting to see, especially heading into the sort of late stretch of the season, because my third takeaway is, we've got to try and stay healthy. I mean, to some extent, you can't control that, right? Football is a violent game. People get hit, people get hurt. That's part of it. But last year we had some really big injuries at the beginning of the year, and we had to overcome that early on and had a couple losses at the beginning of the season. This year, praise the Lord, we've been pretty healthy overall up to this point, with a couple exceptions. But this week was a really tough game where we had DeMarcus Gates go out very early for the entire game. We lost Amari Rogers early for the entire game. Lorenzo Burns had a very scary injury where he had to leave the game on an ambulance. Mark Gilbert also got hurt and had to come out of the game. I mean, that's 3 defensive starters right there who have been key guys for us, as well as a key wide receiver and punt returner. And yes, we have depth, like I just talked about, which is great. We have guys that can sort of step in. But again, at some point, if you keep losing 1, 2, 3 guys, even if you have to bring in a couple guys to fill in for them, and they're coming in, though, mid-season, like I mean, that just starts to make me a little nervous. So, for example, I think right now I'm especially nervous about the linebacker room because I haven't got an update on DeMarcus Gates yet. But hypothetically, let's just say, worst case scenario, he has to go on IR for basically now until the end of the regular season or something like that. Well, at that point, now we've lost Chris Orr to retirement, Scooby Wright to retirement after an injury, potentially DeMarcus Gates, for a handful of weeks. And really, our only starting linebacker or guy that's kind of regularly been a starter that's left is Kiava Tizino. And, we've got Elijah Sullivan and Damon Lloyd, who are both fantastic players and experienced that can, I think, rotate in as well. But neither one has been kind of a main starting guy this season. And then you throw in Malik Hall, who we just signed, who was with us in camp, but hasn't been with us for the past 5, 6 weeks. And he's going to have to get into the mix. And we might potentially have to pick someone else up, just depending on the injury status of some of these guys. And now you're going from one of the deepest, most talented rooms on the Stallions roster at the beginning of the year to, again, not a bad room by any stretch of the imagination, but you're going to, basically 3 or 4 out of the guys in the room are guys that either weren't on the roster at the beginning of the year or were sort of kind of in a backup role, maybe in and off the active game day roster. And so that's a big shift. Again, especially kind of come down to the home stretch of the season where you're starting to play some of the best teams and you're getting ready for the postseason. So, we'll love for us to see, whatever, again, you can't control it. It's kind of a misnomer for me to say we need to stay healthy because you can't really, make that happen. But maybe a better way to see it would say it would be would love to see us stay healthy. I mean, however much that's possible, whatever you can do towards that end, would love to see us be able to just keep guys ready again, especially for that sort of post-season stretch. So those were a couple of my takeaways from the game. Again, overall, it's kind of like last week's blowout against Houston. There's not a lot to critique, not a lot to point out, mostly just positive things to say. But it'll be interesting to see where we go from here. The Stallions are kind of entering a tough stretch of the season. Got a couple more USFL conference games. Got to play Michigan, who looks like clearly the second best team in the USFL conference again. And then we've got to play the 2 best teams in the XFL conference in St. Louis and San Antonio down this home stretch before the postseason. So the Stallions are really going to be tested, and we'll talk about those games in the weeks ahead, of course. Now, as far as my stars for the game, let me just go through them quickly here. My 1-star player, I wanted to give a defensive player. My 2 and 3-star players are going to be offensive players. So for my 1-star player, I did want to at least recognize one defensive player because overall I thought we did have a good defensive performance. It was kind of hard to pick one because so many different guys I thought had a really solid game. The defensive line played great. We had 2 strip sacks that were recovered by defensive linemen. We had some linebackers step in. Again, 4 Gates that played really well. But the guy I wanted to recognize, I got to give my 1-star to Kenny Robertson Jr. He said a couple weeks ago that he needed a pick. It's been a long time, and he got that pick. So it was awesome to see him get that interception and just, again, the juice and energy he brings to the defensive side of the ball and just to the team in general. And, he still came up with 4 tackles, another pass deflection. So great game by him. If you go back and look to the episode I released at the end of last week, previewing the game for the Showboats, I gave out my mid-season awards for the Stallions, and my defensive player of the year up to this point actually was Kenny Robinson. And a lot of the things I talked about when I gave my reasons for why I picked him for that award, he, sort of vindicated me with his performance against the Showboats. So he's my 1-star player. For my 2-star player, I got to go with Marlon Williams. Marlon didn't have the most receiving yards on the day. That actually was Kevin Austin, who had a huge game and was definitely a guy I considered for stars. But most of his production came on one 80-yard touchdown catch, which was incredible. Nothing to take away from him on that. But other than that, he only had a couple catches for about 20 yards. And so in terms of a sort of complete game, I thought Marlon really kind of emerged, especially with the injury to Amari Rogers. Amari Rogers has kind of been the starting receiver in that sort of slot spot, and then Marlon's kind of rotated in. But this week with Amari going down, Marlon had the chance to basically play almost the whole game. And again, really demonstrated why he's one of the best receivers in this league. Had 4 catches for 58 yards, 2 touchdowns, and both were fantastic catches and plays to get in the end zone. He also had 1 rush for 13 yards, which was really impressive. And he did it all without gloves, I'll point out. So, shout out to him for that because you don't really see that in modern football much these days. So just a huge performance, I thought, by Marlon, and wanted to recognize him. Had him on the show before the season kicked off. So go back and listen to that interview with him if you never got the chance to do that. He's actually from Alabama, great guy, and tore his Achilles last year, if you aren't familiar with his story. So it's been awesome to see him come back from that injury, bounce back, and have a huge game this week against the Showboats. And then my 3-star player, again, it's not a real surprise here. You know, I don't love just giving out 3 stars to the same guy every week, but again, I just feel like he's not giving me any other choice. But got to go with Adrian Martinez again. Almost 400 total yards, 4 touchdowns. He's just sort of on another level right now. You know, I think we're getting to that point now where people are starting to ask the question, like, is Adrian Martinez as good and as productive in this offense as Alex Magoo was? And he doesn't have the same body of work yet that Alex did, but he's certainly on that trajectory. We'll have to see what happens with the rest of the season and the postseason. But again, you just can't really say enough good things about his performance. So 3-star player of the week, yet again, goes to Adrian Martinez. So that's going to do it for today. Thank you again for listening, as always. I will say, if you didn't get the chance to listen to my preview before the Showboats game that came out on Saturday morning, I would encourage you to go back and check that out. Not so much for the Showboats part, but because, like I said, I released my mid-season awards on that show. So 5 weeks into the season, halfway, I gave my awards for, if I had to pick, you know, today, who would be my MVP, Offensive Player of the Year, Defensive Player of the Year, Special Teams Player of the Year, and a couple other awards that I handed out. So definitely go and check that out if you're interested in who I picked for those mid-year awards. Also, got to give a shout out to the Birmingham Barracudas. You know, one of my favorite Birmingham spring football brands out of the CFL when they expanded into America back in the 90s, I believe it was. If you don't know about that, pick up a copy of Scott Adamson's book and you will learn lots about it. Hopefully we'll get him on here on the pod at some point to do a history of spring football in Birmingham. But that's all I got for today. Again, thank you all so much for listening. Giddy up.